10 years ago, the United States led an invasion into Iraq, which eventually toppled the government of longtime leader Saddam Hussein. A couple of years later, the world watched as Iraqis voted in their first free elections in decades, emerging from the polling stations with fingers stained purple.
But the transition to democracy has not been easy. Cal Perry is senior executive producer for VOA's Persian News Network and has reported extensively from Iraq. I spoke with Cal about his time there and asked how he would characterize Iraq's democratic transition. How would you characterize it?
Unfinished is how I would characterize it. I think, and I've been surprised by the amount of sort of negative press that the 10-year anniversary has gotten here in the U.S. because I think for so many Iraqis it's still very much unfinished, and for so many American families, especially those who lost loved ones in Iraq or those who are dealing with people with serious injuries still to this day, it's still a very unfinished war.
When you talk about how people perceive it here and how it looks from media reports, from the news that we see coming out of there. Obviously, many people who are here don't have the experience that you've had, which is actually being there on the ground. So what would you say are some of the common misconceptions that people have?
I think certainly the situation there is not a great situation. There's a lot of violence there. We see that on the anniversaries. But I think this idea that the place is still in lockdown, that you can't travel, that families are still split up or maybe still can't get back to their neighborhoods, we know that that stuff is happening. We know families are returning to the places that they live. That's certainly not to diminish, the hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties that were incurred during the war. But the situation, when you look at it as compared to even 2 years ago, is a lot better.
You reported from there for a number of years. What was it like for you being there, and especially when you were embedded with U.S. troops?
I think the trick for many people in Iraq was just showing the U.S. military as a journalist that you're willing to do what they were doing every day. And then you get that kind of access, and you had to have access to the U.S. military in Iraq to be able to cover the story because the security situation was so bad for so long. In order to travel, you had to do so with the U.S. military. And
in terms of security, what types of dangerous situations, if any, did you find yourself in?
Certainly you have the danger of being on an embed. You know you're going to come across a combat type situation. Those are actually oftentimes less dangerous situations because you're with very well-trained soldiers. The time I think where journalists find themselves most in danger is when you're operating unilaterally. You're not with the U.S. military, you're out by yourself, you may have a few private security guards, but certainly nothing overwhelming. And the case in Iraq that became the problem was kidnapping. Everybody became valuable. Everybody had a value, and the kidnapping was something that people really had a hard time stopping.
You talk about having this access to talk to U.S. troops who are over there fighting. What about the access that you had to the Iraqi people?
That's something that came more and more as the war passed, and as time passed. The first few years of the war, it was very difficult to get out and speak to Iraqis who were just trying to live their lives on an everyday basis because the violence was so bad and because you're being targeted as a journalist. So you couldn't go out, even if the mission was to just go out and talk to folks in a marketplace. The moment you arrive, people start noticing you're there. They notice that maybe a Westerner is there, and within a few minutes you could find yourself in a bad security situation. So for the first few years, the real problem was to speak to ordinary Iraqis, you had to go and really use the U.S. military, and that really creates a problem because, of course, you're putting your trust in the U.S. military, and they're going to want to show you their side of the story. So it was getting out and unilaterally reporting, certainly at the beginning, very, very difficult to do. Now we're finally seeing more of those reports, more of those first-hand accounts from Iraqis.
One thing that I did want to touch on is the effects that the Iraq invasion and seeing the toppling of Saddam Hussein, the effects that has had now on other people in the Middle East and other countries. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I don't know sort of what the legacy of this war will be. 10 years in history is such a short time to look back and try to pick a legacy. But when you look at the sea change that we've had across the region and the domino effect that we had from Egypt into Syria, into Libya, places, and it all, of course, started in Tunisia. But before Tunisia was Iraq. And the question I think that people are going to find themselves asking in generations is, because of what the U.S. military did, because of this invasion, whether or not people decide it's just or think it was a just invasion, because of what happened to Saddam Hussein, did that somehow spur what is now known as the Arab Spring? I think that's a question still left unanswered.
A very interesting discussion, Alex, and I know that you're going to put the full interview with Cal on YouTube.
Yes, we will. He had a lot of fascinating insights to share, so definitely something that we want to get out there for everybody to be able to see the full thing.